So thank you for showing up tonight for the lecture face-to-face with Buddhist Deities in Nara. This event is hosted by Japan Foundation Los Angeles and Japanese National Tourism Organization. Right, so before we start the lecture, I'd like to invite Ms. Uchida, Director of JFLA, and Mr. Shoji, Executive Director at JNTO. So, Uchida-san, please.
Good evening. Nice to see you all here. My name is Yasuko Uchida, and I am Director of the Japan Foundation Los Angeles. Japan Foundation is an organization dedicated to carrying out comprehensive international cultural exchange programs throughout the world and was established in 1972. Next year, we will celebrate our 50th anniversary. The Japan Foundation Los Angeles opened its doors in 1983 in Little Tokyo. In 2012, we moved to the Mid-Wilshire Miracle Mile District. We support Japanese language education all over the US and presents arts and cultural exchange programs. Since last year, all of our events have been held online, and we have been delighted to see so many of our patrons, familiar and new, participate in these virtual programs. Today's virtual lecture, Face-to-Face with Buddhist Deities in Nara, introduces Buddhist deity sculptures at famous Buddhist temples, as well as unique and interesting tourism experiences that can be found near each temple. 2 weeks ago, we had a lecture focusing on Kyoto, and today we focus on Nara. For these 2 lectures, we collaborated with the Japan National Tourism Organization, JNTO. Later on, Mr. Kaoru Shoji, Executive Director of JNTO, will make a brief welcoming speech. And now, I would like to welcome our guest speaker, Mr. Michael Van. Michael-san, いますか? Are you there? He was a former research scholar of Japanese art Lakma. He also presented several lectures and curated exhibitions for JFLA. His lectures have been always interesting, informative, as well as persuasive. Subsequently, Ms. Kay Allen, Deputy Manager of JNTO, will introduce unique and fun tourism experiences in Nara. Comparing with Kyoto, Nara is still less popular among foreign tourists and preserves an ancient, serene atmosphere. Personally, I love Nara very much. When the COVID-19 epidemic eventually calms down and international travel is able to resume, I hope you will please visit Nara, deepen your knowledge of Japanese histories and arts, including Buddhist temples and sculptures. Enjoy having local food, mingling with local people, and share your experience with your families and friends. That's all from me. So, Shoji-san, お願いします。
Thank you, Uchida-san. And good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us for the second installment of this series hosted by Japan Foundation and the Japan National Tourism Organization. My name is Kaoru Shoji. I'm the Executive Director of JNTO Los Angeles. So Nara, which will be introduced in this evening's webinar, is an important center of Japanese culture and is home to many sites which are still sacred to Japanese people today. So I hope Today's webinar will deepen your understanding of Japanese culture. Of course, the best way to experience Japanese culture is to visit Japan for yourself. Although travel is currently not possible, we hope that this virtual trip to Japan will inspire and excite you to one day visit some of the places you will learn about today once COVID restrictions are lifted. So we look forward to welcoming you all. But until then, please enjoy today's 90-minute trip to Japan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Uchida and Mr. Shoji. So I guess I will hand it over to Michael right now. So when you are ready, please go ahead and start the lecture.
Absolutely. Well, welcome everybody. It's so nice to have you all joining us again today. I'm very excited to be presenting information about Nara, temples in Nara. If you were with us last time, you saw me present on temples in Kyoto. This time I'm talking about Nara. I'm very, very excited to present some of these. I should have gone right to the beginning there. Sorry about that. So we are talking about Nara, and as was introduced, Nara is one of the, I like to call it the cradle of Japanese Buddhist culture, Japanese Buddhist art, because a lot of what we see in modern day Nara is these remnants of these beautiful art forms that have been created there. So the purpose of this series is to highlight deities in a temple complex. We're looking at sculptures. I will be introducing you to the temples themselves. I'll give you a brief history about the temple, and I will be telling you a little bit about the key figures that played a major role in these temples as well. Some of these figures also contributed to the sculptures. They ended up commissioning them, ended up raising money to be able to create these sculptures. And then some of them ended up being turned into a sculpture themselves. So there are sculptures that depict the founders of these temples, that depict major priests or monks that would have lived at these temples. And I'll be introducing you to some of those. We'll look briefly at the layout. I have these pictures that overlook the entire precincts of the temple, so you'll be able to see how things are dispersed across the entire area. And then, of course, I'll be introducing you to notable sculptures in the area. Now, one thing that I do want to note is that this is going to be a very introductory lecture. I'm not going to be going into the very deepest descriptions of who the deities are. I'm not going to be talking about all the stories related with them. I'm not going to be talking about the specific iconography of them. That is something that you would see in the Who's Who series. So if you want to go back on YouTube, find the Who's Who episodes about Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, wisdom kings, and celestial beings, those will help you identify these figures in a temple context. You'll be able to look at the iconography, you'll be able to look at the clothing, you'll be able to look at many different details on them. But that's not what I'm going to be doing in this lecture. I'm also not going to be discussing any sort of religious precepts. I know that there are a lot of nuances between the different traditions of Buddhism in Japan, but I'm not going to be getting into that here. And then finally, the accessibility of featured sculptures. I just want to briefly say that not all of these sculptures may be available to see at any given time. You will have to do a little bit of research before you go and figure out when some of them will be available to see and when some of them might be hidden from your eye, hidden from the public or kept private. So that's something that you'll have to do a little bit of research ahead of time to figure out. So some key terms that you might hear me bring up, Butsu and Nyorai, those are both titles that are indicators for a Buddha. Bosatsu, if I say that, it's going to be an indicator for a Bodhisattva. So you'll have Kanon Bosatsu, Seishi Bosatsu. Same thing with Myo-o. Myo-o is an indicator for a class of deity called the Wisdom King. I have an entire episode all about them, but the names that you might see associated with the myo are Fudo, Daitoku, and I would recommend that you do some research because they are a very cool class of deities. The 10, that's an indicator for a celestial being. Now, something I do want to point out here is that you'll see all of these, the Butsu, the Bosatsu, and the Myo are all capitalized, but the 10 I have as a lowercase. And that's because the 10 is usually tacked onto the end of a name. So Bishamon 10, Kichijo 10, that's going to be tacked onto the end. Whereas Butsu, Bosatsu, Myo, it will come on as like usually a separate word if you put into a romanization. So Amida, space, Nyorai. Yakshi, space, Nyorai. Same thing with Kanon Bosatsu, same thing with Seishi Bosatsu. Bishimon 10, you might see that as the full name of the deity. And the 10 at the end, it just indicates a celestial being. Now, I will be using a couple times the word cult. And I do want to clarify that I know there are a lot of negative connotations with the word cult. Here I am using it specifically to refer to the worship emphasizing a single entity or a single group of entities. So cults might form around, say, Miroku Nyorai, or you might have a cult that forms around Jizo Bosatsu. And that's not to say that there's a negative connotation to that worship. Rather, it is just focusing on that singular entity. Now, a couple terms that I do want to clarify as well inside the temple. So ji, dera, and in, when you see that tacked on it to the end of a title, it's usually a good indicator for a Buddhist temple or a chapel. Do, when you see it with this kanji here, you might see hondo, kondo, godai-do, shaka-do. So these are purpose-built halls that are often built for a specific deity or built for a specific group of deities. Or it might, it might translate to something like main hall or golden hall. These are all titles for the halls where you go. Not every hall has the name do at the end. Some of them will have zo, some of them will have mon, which indicates a gate. But mostly I will be talking about halls that end with the word do. Honzon, I won't be using that very often here, but I think it's a very important word for everybody to know. Honzon means a principal image. So it's the image that's it's the principal image, it's the deity of focus, it's the image that's the focus in a specific building. So if you go into a shakado, for example, the principal image will most likely be a shaka nyorai. If you go into a kanondo, the principal image most likely will be a kanon. If you go into the godaido, the principal image will be the grouping of the 5 great wisdom kings. Now, hibutsu means hidden Buddha. Now, this is a Buddha that is hidden from the public eye and may be revealed once a month. It might be revealed once a year, might be revealed once every few years. There are some that are only revealed once every 33 years. And there are some that have never been seen by the public eye before. I think there are even generations of monks who haven't seen a specific image. So that's really cool. And then kami shrines. And I have a question mark at the end. And some of you might be surprised that there are shrines dedicated to kami on the precincts of Buddhist temples. And I just want to clarify that that's not uncommon. It's not strange to see something like that happening. Kami worship, what later got called Shinto, and Buddhism, they were actually quite syncretic. They were intertwined. And there's some really cool imagery that you see of both Buddhist deities and Shinto, kami. They're appearing on the same images, and they're really cool, these paintings. Also, there were a lot of questions that were directed my way, both in the question and answers, but also through email asking about materials of Buddhist sculptures. Now, I don't want to say that as a hard rule that the materials will help you identify when a sculpture was made. because one of my favorite things to say is that there is always going to be an exception. So I can't say in good faith that this is the hard rule by which you can identify the date of a sculpture by looking at materials. Rather, we see sort of a trend towards certain materials during certain periods and a movement to certain techniques later on. So for example, when we look at the Nara period, the 7th century, up into the Nara period, the 8th century, we see the use of gilt bronze and something called dry lacquer. And dry lacquer is essentially just using lacquer and fabric, and you were building it up on top of a clay form. And sometimes you will hollow out that clay later on to make a lightweight, portable object. But also during the Nara period, we have clay. And we're actually going to be looking at some clay tableau later on at Horyuji. And this figure actually appears in there. But clay, you usually have armatures in there, supports, because clay itself is quite fragile. It's going to fall apart, it's going to break. So you'll need some sort of armatures, something to be able to keep it steady, something to keep it strong, something to keep it together. But these are really cool clay objects, and I'm excited to show you some of the clay objects that later on. Also, at the during the middle tail end of the Nara period, you have single block wood sculpture, and you know, it's mostly what it sounds like. You take a single block of wood and you carve the sculpture out of that. There are, of course, nuances to it. Sometimes you might attach the arms. You might carve a head separately, like the heads on this Juichiman Kanon, on the crown here. They might be carved separately and attached later on. But largely, the main sculpture is built out of a single block of wood. And you see this largely going on through the Heian period. Until the late Heian period, you start to see something called the joined block technique. And this is actually the back of one of the Ni-o at Todaiji. And you can see all of these different blocks of wood all joined together by these rivets, by these fasteners. They are held there together, and it allowed for much larger sculptures. And it allowed for a depth of relief that is just, for me, during the Kamakura period, it's just unparalleled. I've heard a lot of scholars refer to the Kamakura period as sort of the golden age of Buddhist sculpture. And I can really understand why, just when you look at the dynamism and the life that is attributed to each of these sculptures. Now, you're also going to, how do we figure out these stories of the sculpture? Who made them? What they were made of? Who paid for the sculpture? Who the sculpture depicts? We can't be entirely sure all the time by looking at it, because there might be some other stories underlying where one deity gets transformed into another deity over time. So we do need to look at records of sculptures. And quite often you'll see that there are temple records referring to, oh, in the 8th century, there was a sculpture of Fukukenjaku Kanon carved for this temple. You might also have imperial or aristocratic records talking about something being commissioned by the imperial household for use in a temple. You might also look at courtier diaries. So these aren't just simple diaries. These are diaries talking about projects that were undertaken by the imperial house, and a courtier diary might provide some additional commentary on that. But I think one of my favorite ways to get a record of a sculpture is from the sculpture itself. Now, this is the same sculpture, this Hachiman in the Guise of a Monk by Kaike. It's an impressive sculpture already. If we look at the polychroming on it, we look at the coloration on it, it's just a gorgeous sculpture in and of itself. But we know the history of the sculpture, because on the inside of it, there's all these different inscriptions painted inside there. And so a lot of scholars are able to reference these inscriptions, they're able to reference these writings, and they're able to deduce a history of the sculpture. There are also stories that are told about sculptures, and there's just so many of them. And I will be touching on a few stories, but not many, because it's really hard to find the stories sometimes. Here, for example, at Hasedera, there's a very famous image of the 11-headed Kannon, Juichimen Kannon. And there are stories told about this specific sculpture through something called an engi amaki, so an illustrated hand scroll. And this engi amaki, it talks about how the sculpture was influenced and then created not only by human craftsmen, but also deities. And we can see some deities up here with many arms working on blocks of wood that would later become this 11-headed Kannon. So now to talk specifically about the temples that I think you should visit and the sculptures that I think you should see at these specific temples. So first of all, I'd like you to travel with me to Horyuji. Horyuji is one of the older temples, one of the oldest temples in Japan. It actually has structures that are still standing from the Asuka period. This was originally formed on land that was vowed by Emperor Yomei. So Emperor Yomei, he lived from 517 to 587, and he vowed that Yakushi Nyorai would be the Honzon, would be the principal image of this temple. Now, unfortunately, he died, and the vow had to be fulfilled by his sister and by his nephew, Prince Shotoku. Now, they finished this project, and the smaller temple that was on those grounds at the time was called Wakakusadera. There are 3 buildings that I think we will visit at the Horyuji precinct. We will visit the Shoryo-in, which is right here with the red arrow. We will visit the Kondo, and we will visit the Goju no To, the 5-storied pagoda. So the Shoryo-in, it was originally during the Nara period, it was the living quarters for priests and monks. And it survived that way for a long time. It had to be rebuilt, obviously, because there would have been fires or there would have been destruction happening. But in 1121, there was a renovation that happened there. This is during the Heian period. And then also during the Heian period, we start to see the rise of a Shotoku cult. Now, why would there be a cult that's forming around this specific figure? Now, Prince Shotoku, he was instrumental in the establishment of Buddhism in early Japanese history. He was a major patron of Buddhism. He supported Buddhist teachings. He provided a lot of the funds needed to establish Buddhism and Buddhist temples. He was a massive force to be dealt with during that time, and he helped to establish Buddhism in Japan. And so he becomes this central figure of worship. And the Shoryo-in on Horyuji precinct, it becomes dedicated to the worship of Shotoku Taishi. And there is a sculpture that was commissioned of Shotoku Taishi, which we see right here. Now, in the same building, there is a hidden Buddha of the Nyoirin Kannon, the wish-fulfilling Kannon. And there is a special relationship because Shotoku was considered to be a physical manifestation of this bodhisattva. Now, the Kondo is probably one of the largest and most, I think for me, impressive structures on the Horyuji complex. And it has many different old sculptures that I think you should see while you're in there. The first is Yakushi Nyorai, which was completed in 607, which, if you remember from a couple slides ago, was a sculpture that was vowed by the Emperor Yomei. So that vow he made, but never saw fulfilled, it was actually fulfilled. The sculpture was created, and this represents the fulfillment of a vow to Emperor Yomei by Suiko, and Shotoku. So this is a relatively old sculpture. It is almost 1,400 years old. It is over 1,400 years old. So that's definitely one I think you should check out. Another one that I believe you should check out is the Shaka Triad, which was completed in 623. Now, Toribushi, we know that he was involved in the creation of this triad because there's an inscription on the back that identifies him as the creator. And this sculpture, it was commissioned on behalf of an ailing Shotoku, a Shotoku who was sick. He died, unfortunately, in 622, 1 year before the Shaka Triad was created or completed. But because the image was still completed, there is the belief that Shotoku's spirit could still move on into the Pure Land because of this fulfillment of the vow of the sculpture being created. The final thing that I think I would really recommend that you see in this kondo, of all the sculptures that I believe are very impressive, I think you should see the shitenno. The shitenno, these are the oldest set in Japan, and the shitenno were especially important to Shotoku Taishi because he prayed to them for the success of his projects, the success of his, there were some campaigns, some war campaigns to ensure the long-term establishment of Buddhism in Japan. And the shitenno were central deities that Shotoku prayed for so that these would be successful. Then we've got the Goju no To, the 5-storied pagoda. Now this is a really impressive sculpture, especially because when you go in there, you can see these Buddha, it's a Buddha relic shrine. So it is designed to mimic the spaces where the Buddha's physical remains would be deposited and enshrined. So it is believed that there is a actual physical remains of the historical Buddha buried beneath this pagoda. Now, another very impressive thing about this structure is that there are 4 clay tableaux, so scenes created out of clay, and these all date to the 8th century. And these are all didactic scenes. Now, if you'll remember, I had that little ashra for everybody to see on the material slide, and we can see the ashra is just nestled in there behind the bed upon which the Buddha is passing into the next stage, into nirvana. This is a scene called the parinirvana, or the passing of the Buddha. And we can see, even with the clay, you've got this really beautiful emotion depicted in the faces of these disciples here. The next temple we'll go visit is Todaiji. Now, Todaiji, it was built on, it's a massive temple complex now, but it used to be much, much smaller when it was first founded. It was first founded as Kinshoji, and that was founded in 728. And then the main patron for that project was Emperor Shomu. Now, Emperor Shomu, he had this vision that there would be an entire network of temples around Japan, and that they would all be centered around Todaiji as the hub for this network. And so at Todaiji, he was able to establish many rituals that were devoted to the protection of the nation, but he also turned Todaiji into a center for ritual and learning. And this all happened around the middle of the 8th century. Now, as with most of the temples in Japan, there was a lot of destruction that happened during wars, during fires, and Todaiji is no stranger to having to be rebuilt. One of the most massive undertakings for rebuilding Todaiji was in the 12th century, just at the tail end of it, by a monk called Chogen. And Chogen, he oversaw these massive construction, these renovations, these restorations, and he's become a giant in scholarly study, in making sure that a lot of these sculptures were preserved. A lot of the art at Todaiji was preserved and moved into storage areas that preserve them for future generations as well. Now, one of the sculptures, I think the most famous sculpture at Todaiji, would be this massive Buddha, this Daibutsu, this great Buddha. And I think we see a lot of pictures looking up at the Buddha, but I think to really get a sense of the scale of this figure, I really like this photo looking down past his head, down to that crowd of people over here. You can just see how massive this Buddha is. It's large. It was first completed in 752, but there are later repairs that were done to it, to the head, to the torso. There's a lot of restoration work that happened. So that Daibutsu then, where the great Buddha is, it's sort of at the center of the precinct of Todaiji. But we are also going to go to the Kaidanin, and we are going to go to the Hokedo. So the Kaidanin, it was founded in the middle of the 8th century in 754 by a Chinese monk named Jianzhen. And he came over and he wanted to establish at Todaiji an ordination hall. So a building that was devoted expressly to the ordination of Buddhist monks. So this one was founded in 754, but it was rebuilt after a fire in 1731. And what we see here is a sculpture that was created depicting Ganjin, and that was created 2 years after the rebuilding of the Kaidanin. But that's definitely not the oldest sculpture that is in the Kaidanin. There's these beautiful clay sculptures of the Shitano. So if you remember back to the Horyuji examples, they seem more blockish. They are the oldest set, so there is a certain aesthetic to them that is more simple, more blockish, more square to the shoulders, to the features. But here we have some 8th century clay sculptures, and we can just see these beautiful details in the armor. The face have just these gorgeous expressions on them. The way that the hair is depicted, the way that the helmets are depicted. I really like, especially on Jikokuten here, this little tuft of hair that's coming out the side there. It's just amazing detail, even in the clothing. And these were made 1,200 years ago. It's just unbelievable, the detail that goes into them. Then there was the Hokedo. The Hokedo, it's also known as the Sangatsudo, which is the 3rd month hall. Hokedo, it translates to lotus hall. And this was founded between 740 and 747. And the priest who oversaw the construction of this space was Roben. And Roben, he envisioned the Hokedo, what is now the Hokedo, he envisioned it as the kondo of Kinshoji. And it was the site of something called the Lotus Assembly, and that became the namesake. So the Lotus Assembly, lotus meaning, or hoke meaning lotus, it became the Lotus Hall, Hokedo, and the Lotus Assembly was celebrated in the 3rd month of every year, and so that's why the other name is the Sangatsudo, the 3rd month hall. Another thing that happened here was the preaching of the Flower Garland Sutra, which became a major school of Buddhism in Japan, of which Todaiji was a major teaching center for the Kegon tradition of Buddhism. One of the really cool sculptures to see in there is this Fukukenjaku Kanon, and he is flanked on either side by Nikko and Gakko. Nikko on our right, the deity's left, and Gakko on our left, the deity's right-hand side. Now, this sculpture was created in the 740s. It's made of dry lacquer. And there are scholars who believe that this sculpture was the honzon of the Kinshoji, of the kondo there. Then we've got, I just briefly want to touch on Roben a little bit more, because there are some stories between Roben and Shukongojin. Shukongojin is a singular deity that derives from Vajrapani, which is a diamond wielder. Vajrapani, Shukongojin is often seen as a sort of the singular entity that is split into the Nio, the gate guardians that you see on either side. So while there are Agyo and Ungyo on either side of the entranceway into a temple, Shukongojin is the singular entity from which both of those deities are derived. I know that's super confusing. If you have any further questions about that, please do email me. Now, Roben, he was the second patriarch of Kegon school, and there are stories that he was assisted by Shukongojin. Now, Shukongojin is, the sculpture is also in the Hokkaido, and the sculpture of Roben is in the Kaisando, the Founders Hall. Now, all the stories that are told about Shukongojin and Roben, they are recorded in the 15th century Shukongojin Engiyamaki, which is one of those illustrated scrolls that I showed you before. Next, I'd like to take you to Kofukuji. Kofukuji is another very old temple. It was established on its current ground in 710. There are other versions of a preceding temple on other areas, and it got moved around to different areas before it was finally established on this site by Fujiwara no Fuhito. Now, there is a relationship between Kofukuji and Kasuga, and the Kasuga shrine in Nara is very closely related with Kofukuji. And if you want to know more about that, I would encourage you to please email me, as you'll hear me say many times during this presentation. Email me and I will be happy to provide more information. So the Kei school during the Kamakura period, they are arguably some of the most well-known and most well-beloved sculptors of Buddhist sculpture in Japan. Figures including Unkei, Kaikei, Jokei, they were all involved in the Kei school. And a lot of their sculptures are represented at Kofukuji, and we will be looking at some of them in this presentation. So there are 3 buildings that I'd like to visit: the Chukondo, the Central Golden Hall. There is also a Eastern Golden Hall, and that one is over here, but we will be focusing on the Chukondo, the Central. The Hokuendo, the Northern Round Hall, and then the Kokuhokan, which is a modern-day repository that is climate controlled for objects to be kept. And there are a lot of really cool objects being kept in there. So first of all, the Chukondo, it was completed in 714 by this major Fujiwara figure, Fuhito. There were many fires that happened there, and it's had to be rebuilt so many times that the current building was consecrated in 2018. It is a fairly new structure. But don't let the exterior fool you. The sculptures that are inside are very old and very impressive. So there are, I think, a couple of the pieces that I really like there are of the Shiteno. We have this figure of Tamonten from the 13th century, and just the expression in the body, the way that the body is lifting something so powerfully. And then also Jikokuten, who is pulled a blade out, and you can see the movement in the shoulders and the arms, and there's this latent energy in the sculpture there. And the way that these fabrics come sweeping off the hips, come billowing over the thighs. It's really such an impressive demonstration of carving wood here. At the Hokuendo, the Northern Round Hall, or I've heard it described also as the Northern Octagonal Hall, it was completed in 721, but it had to be rebuilt in 1210. And in 1210, which is around the time that the Kei school was present at Kofukuji, we've got some different examples of sculptures from different periods. We have Shitano from the 8th century. We have bodhisattvas from the later Muromachi period. But I think the ones that are most impressive in this hall are the Miroku Nyorai, the monk Sesshin, and the monk Mushaku. And these are done by I would say, probably the most famous Buddhist sculptor in all of Japanese history, Unkei. Unkei, he is a very well-known name, and in 1212, he created these 3 figures that we see in between the pillars there. Especially these 2 figures I would like to focus on, mostly because if we look at their faces are so lifelike. These aren't, when you look at them, you don't think of like an idealistic portrayal of figures. Rather, when you look at these, you think of almost a portrait of living figures. Now, unfortunately, these could not have been based on any living figure, so these are an estimated guess, because both of these figures, they lived during the 5th century. So there is a generational divide. And not only did they live in the 5th century, they were in a completely different country. They were Indian monks. And so there's this national divide, there's this generational divide. And so these are Unkei's best estimates as to how these figures may have looked. But if we really go in close on the faces, you can see that these are so lifelike. And part of that realism is accomplished through the use of crystal in the eyes. You can see that glitter of life behind those eyelids. You can see a pupil, and you can see this is colored paper put on the back of rock crystal. And it just creates this beautiful effect of a human face with life. The Kokuhokan also has these beautiful sculptures, the Ashura, which is a very famous sculpture, also the Karura. These are both figures from the Hachibushu, the 8 legions that protect the Dharma. We also have Ryutoki and Tentoki, and these are 2 demons who had been converted, and as in gratitude to the Buddha, they provide lanterns and provide light to the Buddhist faithful. The last temple that I would like to take you to very quickly is Shinyakushiji. Now, this isn't a large temple compared to Kofukuji, Todaiji, Horyuji. This is a much, much smaller temple. It was founded in 747 by Empress Komyo on behalf of Shomu, who was sick. There was a 7 Yakshi program. So Yakshi is a medicine Buddha. And the reason you wanted to have 7 Yakshi is it just makes these prayers for healing even more poignant when you have more figures there. It was restored later on during the Kamakura period by Myoe and Joke. And then we have the Hondo. The Hondo is really one of the only structures that is standing on this precinct. There's a Jizodo, a hall dedicated to Jizo Bosatsu, but really the only major sculpture is this, the only major structure is this Hondo. And it was built over a ritual space. And it was built pre-762, but then it was replaced during the Heian period. Sorry, that's a little bit confusing. So this Hondo, it replaced a larger Kondo that was destroyed. So this is a newer building, whereas the older building was replaced. In that Kondo, in the Hondo, you will find this figure of Yakshi surrounded by the Juni Shinsho, the 12 heavenly generals, the 12 divine generals. So Yakshi Nyorai, the figure itself, was completed between 780 and 810. It's the central figure for a medicine Buddha cult. And the original mandorla, this thing behind it, it would have depicted the 7 medicine Buddhas. But it is a current Edo period replacement, and the iconography was not followed as closely. And what we have here now are 7 Buddhas of the past. And then finally, we have these figures, the Juni Shinsho, the 12 directional guardians, the generals associated with the different directions around Yakshi. The three figures that I want to focus on are these very well portrayed figures. Shindara, Bazara, and Kira. I really do think that if you have a chance, Shinyakshiji would be a beautiful temple to visit, simply because these life-sized figures of the 12 celestial generals. And now I will turn it over to Kei-san.
Hello. Wow, that was so interesting. One moment, we'll get started here. All right. Here we go. So as mentioned, my name is Kay Allen and I'm with JNTO Los Angeles. And we are here as a tourism and travel information resource for all visitors going to Japan. So I want to give you some destination information today on Nara. If you have the ability to go in the future, these would be some great places to visit in addition to everything that Michael highlighted. And just to give you a quick update on the current border enforcement measures that are in place right now, they are in place until further notice, and this extends to foreign nationals from 150 plus countries, including the US. And you can stay updated and informed on our COVID-19 advisory page for updates on any changes in those border restrictions. And you can also contact your local Consulate General of Japan for more information on special entries and transiting through the airports, etc. Now, I wanted to start off with some quick access just so you can get an idea of where Nara is in scope of the country. Nara is easily accessible from either Tokyo, Kyoto, or Osaka. If you're coming from Tokyo, it's about 2.5 hours by bullet train to Kyoto, and then another 45 minutes, give or take, from either Kyoto or Osaka on a local line. And Nara is characterized, as many have mentioned already, as being a very important center for Japanese history and culture, including 8 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Of course, the national treasure deer that you can see wandering about Nara Park and the surrounding mountains, and then a very rich and beautiful tea culture. Now, just to give you an idea of where the temples that Michael mentioned are actually located in Nara Park and adjacent Horyuji area, as you can see, they're very easily accessible from either Kintetsu Nara Station or JR Nara Station, most of which in walking distance. So you could do this feasibly in an afternoon and be able to see all of these temples. Horyuji Temple is not located in Nara Park specifically, but it's a quick 11 to 12-minute train ride from JR Nara Station, so you can also seamlessly incorporate that as well. Now, I want to give you some highlights from a few different areas in Nara, including the Nara Park area, Nishino-kyo, Sakurai and Uda, the Asuka and Kashihara area, and the very big area that you see at the bottom being Yoshino. And Horyuji was touched on by Michael, so we'll let that be his description. And starting off with Nara Park, as you can see, we have over 1,200 wild deer that wander around Nara Park. And as I mentioned, they are messengers of the gods and national treasures, and very fun to interact with. And if you bow to them, they will actually bow back to you. And throughout Nara Park, you can also find many of these tea stalls, great places where you can stop, rest for a bit, and also enjoy a hot cup of tea or matcha, and also some Japanese tea sweets. And as Michael mentioned, there is some connection to temples also found with shrines. And one such is the Kasuga Taisha Shrine, which he touched on earlier. And this houses actually 4 main deities and about a dozen lucky gods. And it was built in 768 by the Fujiwara clan. And it's very easily identifiable in pictures by the many hanging bronze lanterns that you can see here. and over 3,000 stone lanterns that actually line the pathways leading up to the shrine. And during mid-August, they actually do the Mandoro Lantern Festival here, where all of these lanterns are lit up beautifully, and it's a very spectacular event to see. And it was actually the first to use what's now been called the Kasuga style, which incorporates a Chinese style roof and that beautiful red, gold, and vermilion colors that you can see here. Now moving on to the next area, which is Nishino-kyo. This is where you can find a Saidaiji Temple. And this is actually the counterpart to Todaiji Temple. And it's known for a very unique tea ceremony called the Ochamori tea ceremony. And this is where you actually drink from gigantic oversized teacups, which are actually 40 centimeters in diameter and can weigh as much as 7 kilograms. And you actually need assistance from your neighbor to help you lift the cup in order to drink it. But this is believed to foster unity among the guests. So this is a very interesting ceremony. They do it about 3 times a year. And in addition to this, they also have in their main hall a beautiful Shakyamuni Buddha made of wood that dates back to about 1249. And it's available for public viewing in the spring and autumn seasons. So as Michael mentioned, some of them are not available year round, and this is one such sculpture. Now moving on to Yakushiji Temple, this is not to be confused with Shin Yakushiji Temple, which Michael touched on, but this temple is actually known for its healing powers, and it was erected by Emperor Tenmu in 680. And it features the medicine Buddha, which Michael mentioned, the Yakushi Nyorai. And the interesting thing about this complex is the pagoda that you see that's central in the complex actually utilizes an optical illusion to make it appear as though it's 6 stories tall when it's actually only 3 stories tall. And this is by using the eaves to create the illusion that each additional eave is a separate floor. And so it's very interesting and very beautiful, as you can see from the picture here. Now moving on to the next site, we have Heijo Palace site. And this is actually very important, obviously, as it was the palace for Nara when it was the capital of Japan. It may surprise some to know that Nara was the capital prior to Kyoto and Edo, now modern day Tokyo. And excavations are still underway on this site, and many of the attractions, including the Daigokuden Hall, which you see here, are actually reconstructions. This one in particular was built for the 1300th anniversary of Nara, and they also have an excavation site exhibition hall, which features remnants of old buildings and artifacts, so you can see things that they've found in past excavations, as well as get updates on current digs that are still ongoing. Now moving on to the Sakurai and Uda area, our first stop will be the beautiful Muroji Temple. This is one that I'm very interested to visit myself. It's found on Mount Muro, and it's a very remote mountain temple, but it's unique in that it welcomes many different denominations of Buddhism, and it holds many national treasures, such as an 11-faced Kannon, which was mentioned earlier as well as a wooden Shaka Nyorai. And this is actually known as the Women's Koyasan because it began accepting female worshippers much earlier than many of the other temples, as early as the Kamakura period. And it's also known for a very beautiful rhododendron festival, which you can see the rhododendrons displayed in the picture here. And this is held every spring in about mid-April to May, and you can see over 3,000 blooms of the rhododendrons. So definitely visit this temple if you get the chance. Now, our next stop is going to be Hasedera Temple. This is another mountain temple, and it was first built in 686. Today, it's still a training complex and library for monks, and it houses an 11-face canon, and the priests reportedly, which Michael touched on this earlier, it's very interesting. The legend has it that a priest reportedly carved a second 11-face canon, but cast it into the ocean, where it then washed up on the shores of Kamakura. And this is purportedly the reason why there is a second Kamakura temple or Hasedera temple in Kamakura. One of the interesting features is this beautiful wooden staircase that leads up to the main hall with over 400 steps. And it's open on the sides, so you have beautiful sweeping views of the mountains and the forest there. And they planted peonies right outside of the viewing area for the stairs so that you have beautiful spring blooms. The main hall is also open on most sides so that you can see the mountains, and it's beautiful no matter what season you're there, but I think fall is particularly lovely. And then our next stop will be the Yamanobe no Michi Trail. This is actually one of the oldest roads in written record, and it was part of the Shinkaido, which was a massive road that snakes its way through the countryside. And it's interesting because of all of the temple ruins and burial mounds of past emperors that are dotted along this major route. And one such, which you can see in the picture here, is the burial mound of Emperor Sujin. And this is a 240-meter long key-shaped hole burial mound, which is a very common shape that you'll see in burial mounds. And this is dated to about 148 BC, so very old. But this route really offers gentle hiking, and it's a great place to get insight into rural life, meet some locals as you travel along this trail. So you can hike segments of it, but you can also rent bicycles as well and go for a lovely ride in the countryside. Our next stop is going to be the Asuka and Kashihara area of Nara, and we'll start with Imaicho town. This is a great place to sort of travel back in time. It's one of the largest traditional districts in Japan with 500 old-style houses and stores, most of which still retain their original Edo construction. And it's so very much like a sort of portal back in time that it's actually very frequently used for filming traditional samurai dramas and period pieces. And you can just wander along the streets and duck into shops. There are plenty of places where you can try sake and soy sauce from the brewers. And also many of the houses are actually open to the public and can be toured. And there are many special events held here, such as festivals and even flea markets, where you can find some very interesting antique souvenirs. Now our next stop is Ishibutai Tumulus, and this is a very historically significant site, especially to Buddhism, as it was the burial mound for the head of the Soga clan, Soga no Mako, and he worked very closely with Prince Shotoku in order to spread the influence of Buddhism across Japan. And the ceiling stone that you see here actually weighs about 140 tons, and it's called Ishibutai because of that flat structure that makes it look like a stone stage. It's surrounded by beautiful nature, and it's beautiful no matter what season you visit, but spring, of course, is particularly lovely with the cherry blossoms in bloom. And then in the autumn, you have the blooming of hundreds of spider lilies. So this is a great place to visit. Now, our next stop is a particularly unique temple. This is Tsubosaka-dera, and this employs a mixture of Japanese and Indian styles. So you have this very beautiful view that you see here, mixture of pagodas and the seated Buddhas, and the complex also features some bas-relief carvings in white stone. So there are a lot of really beautiful pieces of artwork to see here. And local legend claims that one of the priests uncovered a Senju Kanon, or a 1,000-armed Buddha, that imbued him with healing powers. And so he was able to cure the empress of an eye disease. And even today, people still believe that it is a place to heal yourself of eye conditions. So our next and final area is going to be the Yoshino area. This I really feel like is categorized by just so much beautiful nature, and the place that you may want to go and stay to have a really sort of traditional stay in a Japanese inn is going to be Doragawa Onsen. And this is located at the foot of Mount Omine, which is actually a very sacred site for practitioners of Shugendo. That sort of a mountain asceticism. And Doragawa Onsen caters regularly to pilgrims of Shugendo that travel to this area on pilgrimage. And the baths of Doragawa Onsen are kept at a lower temperature, so even during the summertime, it's possible to enjoy them. They stay at about 26 degrees Celsius. And as I mentioned, this area is sacred for Shugendo, but it's also beautiful for just going around and enjoying the nature, such as Mitarai Gorge. This is a great place for hiking, for spotting waterfalls, and it's beautiful, particularly in autumn, as you can see here. And not too far, you can find Yoshinoyama, or Mount Yoshino. And this is another sacred spot for Shugendo practitioners, but it's very famous for its over 30,000 cherry trees, which bloom in the spring and make all of the mountain look sort of pink. So very, very worth seeing during that spring season. But it's got a mix of sacred shrines and temples in this area because of the way that Shugendo is practiced. So you can find very iconic temples such as Kimpusenji, which is sort of the iconic temple for Shugendo for this area. And then also beautiful shrines such as Yoshino Mikumari Shrine. So this is a great place for you to visit if you want to get a little bit more nature. Now, I wanted to touch very lightly on cuisine because Nara has, of course, all of the staples that you can find many other places, but also some regional cuisine that I highly recommend. Their tea is exquisite, so if you do get the chance to participate in a tea ceremony, I highly recommend it. Some other dishes include kakinoha sushi, which is wrapped in persimmon leaves, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But you can also find miwa somen noodles, which there are many places in and around temple complexes that serve miwa somen. It's kind of very iconic for this area and associated with quite a few different temples and parts of Nara. And then you can also find some really beautiful mountain vegetable and root based cuisines, such as you can find at a restaurant known as Kusano-e. And this is found in Nara City, not too far from Nara Park. Now, I wanted to give you a couple of hands-on activities, which are very fun if you get to travel to Nara. The first of which being do-it-yourself kakinoha sushi. And as I mentioned, this is wrapped in persimmon leaves, and it's usually salmon or mackerel that's been lightly vinegared and put atop sushi rice before being wrapped. And this preserves the freshness of the fish, and it's a very sort of old practice, predating modern refrigeration, obviously. So this helped to kind of keep the fish to last longer. I've had the pleasure of being able to do this myself. It's quite fun. And the top right photo is actually my lunch. So as you can see, they give you quite a lot of really delicious foods to go along with it. The next activity is going to be handmade nigiri sumi inkstones. This is really fun. Nara is very well known for ink brushes, but also for the ink itself. And they're still one of the largest producers of sumi ink. And at this activity, which this gentleman here is part of a generations long line family business of creating ink. But when you visit this establishment, you can learn all about how the ink is made, and then they give you ready to form piece of sumi, as it takes quite a while for it to process. There's a lot of fermentation that goes on with the kind of like gelatinous elements of the ink before it dries out and becomes the stone that we see up at the top right. And when it is this sort of squishy ink substance, you can squeeze it in your hand, and then the stone itself takes the mark of your palm. So it's personalized to you. There's only one inkstone like it in the whole world, and you can take it home as a really wonderful souvenir. Our final activity is going to be hiking the portion of the Kumano-Kodo that crosses into Nara. This is the Kohechi Trail, and this touches very briefly into several very rural villages bordering Wakayama and Nara. And it's a great place for you to experience really rural life, stay off in a traditional Japanese inn, eat some of the local regional cuisine, and then hike through these beautiful paths that you see here. And if you're very adventurous, you can continue on as it leads to Koyasan, but you can just limit yourself to this little portion that goes in through Nara. Now that's it for me, but if you have any questions about traveling to Japan or about any of the places that you've seen here, please do let us know. You can send us an email and we'll be happy to assist you further. So thank you so much.
So now at this time, I'm going to open the floor up to questions. I see that some people have put some questions in the Q&A box. I can hazard a guess at some of these, and hopefully I can answer some of them sufficiently for others. So the first question, I want to look at Thomas's question. He says, I tend to translate hondo and kondo as main hall for my students and tell them there isn't really any difference in meaning. Is that incorrect? No, I wouldn't say it's incorrect at all. They both serve as the main central hall in most Buddhist temples. The research that I've done on the hondo and kondo is that during one time period, it's referred to as a kondo, and then it later became called the hondo. That's what I came across in my reading, but I think there's probably a more nuanced differentiation between the two. But I think what you are telling your students as to it being a main hall, I think that's absolutely fine. I don't think you're I don't think you're giving them any misinformation at all. If anything, maybe the literal translations of them, hondo would be sort of like central hall or like origin hall, and then kondo would be golden hall. I think those are the literal translations of them, but they both serve as main halls, I think, is what I'm trying to get at. And then Tony asks, did the statues have any color pigments? Oh, yes. So a lot of these sculptures would have been painted, or they would have been gilded. They would have been polychromed. So I don't know if you're familiar with the polychroming process, but essentially you would take paper and you would fix it around the wooden sculpture, and you would use lacquer, and you would create this sort of really rough surface that pigments would be able to adhere onto. And you could paint the robes to be a certain color, very vivid blues, very vivid greens. Actually, at Horyuji, there's a beautiful pair of sculptures in the kondo of Bishamon-ten and Kichijo-ten. And their robes are not just like a plain color. They are absolutely vivid patterns. And you've got these blues and these greens and these roundel patterns and these golds that have been affixed onto these pigments. And it's just a visually stunning aesthetic. So sometimes you can have colors painted onto them. Sometimes you will have gilding. You will have kirikane. You will have this sort of gold, thin, cold foil that is very, very fragile and it tears easy. And you would stick it onto the sculptures and you would affix it so that it would stay on and create this bright golden sheen. Stories told about the Buddha a long, long time ago is that he has skin that glows like gold. And so being able to recreate that in a temple setting using materials like gold, and then also using color pigments like I was describing to create these vivid robes, I think would create this really beautiful image that when practitioners go into the space, they would be beside themselves. They would be excited. They would be ecstatic to look on this image that is so beautiful. And then, so there's a question that what is the Japanese term to refer to such a cult around one deity? I'm not familiar with the term cult. I'm not sure if they would have referred at that time. I'm not sure they would have referred to it as a cult. I think they would have just seen it as Yakshi worship or Jizo worship. And then I will answer one more question and I will turn it back over to Kei-san. There's a question I believe that she would be able to answer in there. So Yumiko asks, why are there hidden Buddhas? Are they kept hidden for restoration? So no, there is a temple tradition built into moving images away from public sight. And there are different ideas as to why this is. Some of it is to give the deities some respite from being under the constant watchful eye of the public. Other times is that they are just being hidden because they are so sacred. They are set aside. They are kept private from the public because they want to maintain the sacrality of the image. And really, it's up to the clergy of these temples to decide when they will reveal these sculptures, when they will keep them hidden away. And it's not just sculptures, it's paintings as well. Paintings can be called a hidden Buddha as well. And they're hid behind these curtains, or they're hidden behind these heavy wooden doors, or they're hidden inside these portable shrines that the doors closed. So a lot of it is based on temple tradition, and that temple tradition can be broken or it can be followed very, very closely. And then Michael and Fiona Carlin, sorry, very quick question. What is the significance of the number of stories in a pagoda? That is a very, very good question. One that I am not entirely able to answer right now. But if we keep in contact through email, I will do my best to research and we can correspond about that. So thank you so much for that question. Kei-san, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I think there was one question asking, can anyone enter the temples? Are there any special requirements, from Tony? So this is going to depend on the temple. There are some temples where certain areas are accessible while others are not. As Michael has shown you with the sort of overhead shots, there are many different structures in a given complex. So there may be some that are accessible while others are not. And if there are tickets that need to be purchased, for example, that is the case with some temples, there will be signs that will explain to you which areas need a ticket to be purchased in order to enter. And then some have very expansive grounds that are just open. So it really does depend upon the temple itself. There are some, for example, where like Saidaiji Temple, you can purchase one ticket and then you have access to all of the halls on the complex. So it really just does differ from temple to temple, but there will be some sort of visitor's guide or signage that will let you know where you need to purchase tickets if you do. Yep, I think that was it for the questions that I can answer.
I believe you got one more in the chat that just popped in.
Oh, let's see here. Down to the bottom. If you are in the Los Angeles area, you can fly into Tokyo and fly out of Osaka. There are direct flights to Los Angeles from both either Haneda and Narita International Airports, and also Kansai International Airport in Osaka. So if you are limited for time, and let's say you've got a 7-day itinerary, you want to save some time and not have to travel all the way back to Tokyo, then you can do that. If it's between either taking the bullet train or flying from Osaka to get back to Tokyo, I would always recommend just taking the bullet train. It's so much quicker to be able to just get to the train station, zip over, not have to go through all of the hassle of security checks, etc. So you can if you're from this area, but if not, bullet train is a great way to get back to Tokyo.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of this series. This was the final lecture for our Face-to-Face with Buddhist Deities lecture series. So thank you to everyone for joining. As Kei-san said, for further information about travel destinations and cultural activities, you can visit their website. And if you have any further questions about sculptures and temple history, I would be happy to answer those through my personal email, which I have on the screen there, my first name and my extremely long last name at gmail.com. And I will turn it over to Takehira-san.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michael-san and Kei-san, for the very interesting and highly informative presentation. And I hope you all enjoyed this tonight's lecture. So we set up a quick survey. I think it's on your screen right now. Yes, it's on your screen right now. So please, we'd really appreciate if you answer this before you leave. And so we've added you to JFLA emailing list so you can get info about upcoming events. So we look forward to seeing you again at our events in the future. So that'll be all for the day, I think. So thank you again for coming tonight. Yes. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Have a great night.